So this is a personal essay I wrote a few years ago. My husband and I are expecting our first child in August. Thank you. And it's taken us a really long time to get here, about 10 years. So this is about kind of turning 30 and knowing that there's all these things ahead, but not knowing when they're going to get here. When I moved out of the apartment where I had spent the most tumultuous years of my mid-20s and into my first two-story house, the youngest of my two cats, Birdie, gained 2 pounds. 2 pounds may not seem like a lot, but for little runt of the litter Birdie, it meant that she was suddenly 150% of her original size, her body stretching longer and her haunches thicker and stronger than they ever were before. I didn't even really need to weigh her to know that she had changed. At the apartment, she had spent most of her hours tucking her meek white and gray body into the corners of closets and crawl spaces, desperate for a pocket of space to call her own. In the house, she'll curl up next to me on the couch or bed and even greet company when they stop by for a visit. She's confident and affectionate, chirping happily as she trots around. She's practically a brand new cat. It's been years now since bashful 4-pound Birdie transitioned into brave 6-pound Birdie, and it's hard for me to describe just how significant that move was to people who meet her. She grew like a goldfish, I told friends again and again, but I don't think cats biologically respond to their surroundings like pet fish, accordioning to fit the space around them. So how do I explain that as far as I can tell, Birdie needed to live in a house with extra rooms and stairs and a yard in order to become the courageous and empathetic cat she was meant to be? You didn't know this was going to be all about cats. I was thinking a lot about Birdie on my most recent trip to New York City. It was the 7th trip since first visiting the enormous, sprawling metropolis 5 years ago, and every time I return, I get an adrenaline rush as soon as I see the skyline. As I move through the city, I enter what feels like a meditative state. I ride the subway in blissful anonymity, at peace with my nothingness and marveling at how utterly inconsequential I am to this great big world around me. It might sound counterintuitive, but I go to New York, one of the busiest and most bustling cities in the world, to reconnect with my innermost desires and revel in peaceful solitude. This time I spent half the trip lost in thought. As I rode the subway cars with my husband Ben and wandered up one block and down another, I could feel myself deflecting one question after another. What's going to happen to us? What does it mean that I feel so peaceful here and that Ben and I seem so happy? Is it just because we're on vacation? What if we lived here? Could we raise a child in this place, or would that wait until later? Maybe I would lose weight from all the walking, or write a book, or play in a jazz band. What kind of fantastic life could we imagine living on these dark streets? On the plane ride out to New York, I read a beautiful book by a Minnesota author named Kate Hopper about her experience having a preemie baby. In the book, she finds respite in a quote by Rainer Maria Rilke that I hadn't heard before, but I found myself repeating it in my head again and again as I paced through Manhattan. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, the quote goes. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Live the questions now. Live the questions now. I said it over and over like a mantra, thinking about what Kate had gone through in the book and how tortured I was over a period of my life that was decidedly free of trauma. But the truth is, despite all the happy developments of the past 2 years, getting married to a man whom I love deeply and profoundly, and finding a professional path that could be described as a dream, I still find myself teetering atop a precipice, desperate to look out into the future and see what comes next. People talk a lot about the process of getting married and grappling with what they want to do professionally, and the fear and overwhelming love that sweeps over them when they find out they're pregnant or their first child is born. But what about this gray period that falls in between? What about the agonizingly long year or more, turns out it was 5 years, that might stretch out between when you know you want something and when you feel like you might finally be ready to dive in? How will I know I'm ready to take the next step? Will Ben know he's ready? What if we never are? How long have I been holding in my breath? Every time we go back to New York, I take Ben on at least one dizzying quest to find a place where we can see the whole city at once. We've taken ferries to Staten Island and back, we've climbed the hills that lead up to the cloisters, and we've paid tourist fees to skyrocket up to the top of Rockefeller Center. Also, I can breathe in the magnitude of the city and try to wrap my arms around its endless possibilities. This time, we rode a subway car underneath the waters of the East River, popped out of a staircase in the trendy neighborhood of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and walked westward until we hit the riverfront so we could drink in the Manhattan skyline at dusk. On the ride over, the Rilke quote was still ringing in one ear, "Live the questions." But so was the melody of a song by an artist from Minneapolis named Dan Wilson. In the air, the questions hang. Will we get to do something? Who we're gonna end up being? How are we gonna end up feeling? What you gonna spend your free life on? Standing on the bank of the river in Brooklyn as the sunset behind the south end of Manhattan, I scanned the city from end to end. I couldn't believe how short the distance seemed between the new Freedom Tower on my left and the Empire State and Chrysler buildings to my right. I knew that the island of Manhattan was only 2 miles wide and 8 miles long, but suddenly it was astonishing to me how manageable it all seemed. I finally knew how to navigate the subways without getting lost. I knew how to shout my bagel order over the counter without my inner Minnesotan getting embarrassed. And I knew which buildings were in which parts of town and where the good places were to eat, drink, and live. When had this all happened? It looks smaller from here, doesn't it look smaller? I asked Ben, shaking my head. He smiled and shrugged. Of course, the city hadn't changed at all, at least not in any sizable way we could scope out from that shoreline. But like Birdie had transformed when I moved her into the bigger house, I wondered if it was this time I who had grown. Standing between the burrows with the wind at my back and the sun sinking behind the buildings in front of me, for a moment the city felt quiet and all the questions faded away.